From Lansing Community College, this is LCC Connect, and this is Lanstories, with me, David Siwik. Each episode explores a different topic, such as the people, business, neighborhoods, communities, buildings, and other phenomena that make up the history of our college and our region. We tell stories, and in doing so, we connect the past to the present.
On this episode of Lanstories, we are going to pick up where we left off a little while ago. For those of you who are our loyal listeners, you will remember that we did a lovely show on signs and signage here in Lansing, and kind of the general idea of figuring out why you're getting around and what needs to be done, and the role that signs play in that. And to help us along those lines, we had a wonderful guest in here. Daniel Siwik joined us in studio, and he joins us again today to discuss more about Lansing area signs. So Daniel, welcome to our program.
Thank you. Happy to be back.
Very happy to have you with us. And just to give kind of a quick refresher of our previous program, which I would encourage all of you to go back and listen to if you have not had a chance to do so yet. On the last program, we started talking about sort of some general ideas of communication and public communication and the role signs play in that. As Daniel correctly identified, signs are a very old and important part of human civilization, actually. And then we got into looking at some really cool old signs that are in Lansing, actually, including some that are from businesses and buildings that have either been repurposed or don't exist anymore, really, in the form they once did. And that's kind of where we're going to pick up here today in part 2 of this Lansing sign episode. So, Daniel, you brought along with us today some photographs, but you also brought, more importantly, some discussion about those photographs. What's the first thing that we're going to consider as we're looking at the signs of this area here?
Well, the first thing I'd like to talk about is a small building that some of you may be familiar with. I'll show the picture here briefly. This was the one of the Sinclair Oil's gas stations that were prominent all around the United States in the early part of the automobile era of the last century.
Sure, and the visual that Daniel's showing up, for those of you that are listening to the podcast and aren't able to catch the video, it is a photo of a building that actually is in Lansing currently. It sits at the corner of Grand River and Capitol Avenue. Is that correct, or is it Seymour Street?
It's Seymour.
Seymour. So Grand River and Seymour on Lansing's north side, just on the edge of downtown and Old Town, really kind of in between Old Town and downtown, actually, the Walnut neighborhood. And that gas station, well, that's what it was when it was built. It was a gas station. And how long has that been there?
Well, if according to the little sign that sits by the historical marker, it was actually built designed in 1923.
Sure. So early 1920s, and Lansing is booming, bustling industrial town like most of southern Michigan was at the time. And of course, Lansing was booming for a variety of reasons, one of which was being automobile production. Lansing has a very rich and long history of automobile production, including brand marquees, General Motors, Oldsmobile, and then, of course, the Real Motor Car Company and Durant Motors were all manufacturers at one time in this area. And so cars were a big deal here in Lansing in the early 1920s, weren't they?
Yes, indeed. And a little backstory about this particular building. It was a Sinclair Oil's gas station. Sinclair was a prominent gas station franchise, or if you will, much like what you would expect to find now with a Shell or a Speedway or have you. The company was actually around until quite recently in one form or another. But the Sinclair brand was kind of an iconic sign that many motorists would have been accustomed to at the time. And their branding was kind of centered actually around the building in a lot of ways. And the signage, of course, was integral to that. This building you see here, and I'll hold the photo up again briefly, so those of us watching can see it. But I can describe it as well. The building itself was designed in an arts and crafts style, if you will, which was popular at the time. Sinclair Oils kind of incorporated some of their branding, though, into it as far as the tile roof, the terracotta tile roof. Those were prominent on the gas stations. But then, of course, the signage. Now, this building has been wonderfully restored, and it didn't keep all of the signage, but it kept some of it, particularly the hand-painted Sinclair Oils window lettering on one of the upper windows, lights as we call them, skylight windows. There's also the pump itself has some of the Sinclair branding on it, which is very iconic.
Complete with 17 cents and 9 tenths a gallon.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice?
It sure would be. Gas isn't anywhere near that cheap these days. By golly, I drove by a gas station actually not too long ago, and it was well north of $3 a gallon. So, yep, would have been a lot cheaper back then. That's for sure. Now, Sinclair Oil. You mentioned that. You mentioned that there's still some of the. Well, now we would call it. Would you call that historic branding? What would you refer to it when somebody paints or in some way illustrates off of a previously existing branding? Is there
historic reproduction.
Historic reproduction?
Recreation.
And that building, it's now a National Historic place. It's on a registry, National Historic Registry, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Which is really something. And I wonder if not only the architectural style, but also the fact that that was a Sinclair Oil station that we can identify for sure, and the building's still there. Do you think that might have had a little bit of a role to play in why that one of all, well, number one, survived, and then number
Yes.
two eventually ended up becoming a historic place?
I think for sure. And what's interesting, a lot of things are interesting about this little building, not the least of which is the location of it. Even in the 1920s, that would not have been a really high-traveled intersection as far as ones that we think of nowadays. But the station itself would have been located there as much for the residents to gas up their cars as it would have been for motors passing through. And Sinclair Oils was, even though they had certain branding standards with their buildings, they tried to keep them so they didn't stick out unnecessarily in the communities. That's why this one is a arts and crafts style, like some of the homes you would find there. But yet they kept their terracotta clay roof and, of course, the iconic branding.
Yeah, and it is really a lovely looking building. And it fits in very well in that neighborhood, actually. In full disclosure, Daniel and I both lived in that neighborhood at one time and are not too distant past, so we're quite familiar with it, and absolutely that fits in very well. And the Sinclair Oil Company, actually, the name Sinclair ended up becoming involved. Daniel and I were just talking about this not long ago, actually, in one of the great political scandals. Great. When I use that word, caution here, I'm using it in reference to the way people used it back then, meaning big, not necessarily good.
Yes.
And the Teapot Dome scandal is what I'm referring to. And Sinclair of Sinclair Oil, the company, ended up becoming involved in it. And now we could devote quite a program to the Teapot Dome scandal, but that's going to take us all the way out to Wyoming. This is Lanstories. We'll sum it up with maybe the couple-minute version of it. Warren G. Harding was president. It's the early 1920s, and technology is changing at the time. That gas station, even in existence, is, well, it's evidence of it. The technology I'm referring to is energy. There's a revolution going on, and it's the use of petroleum products. And the U.S. Navy, all of a sudden, has a great need for oil, right? Because it's powering their ships. So the Congress passed a law making it easy for the government to lease oil reserves. One such individual charged with leasing those oil reserves was a guy by the name of Albert Fall. He was the Secretary of the Department of the Interior. And when some of these leases went online for the first time, people noticed that very shortly thereafter, Albert Fall's standard of living seemed to have increased dramatically.
How about that?
Yeah, he paid off many years of back taxes that he owed on his property and had some other improvements done onto the land. The long and short of it is that money was money that oil companies had bribed him with. And the Sinclair Company happened to be one of the ones that was involved in that bribery scandal. The curious thing about that is fall ended up being convicted and sentenced to prison. I believe he was until Richard Nixon's Attorney General was sentenced to prison later on in the wake of the Watergate scandal. I think it had been up until that point. So only 2 in the 20th century of presidential cabinet officers ended up in prison. So anyways, that's kind of a little bit of a diversion that we ended up going down the road there. But the Sinclair Oil name is, well, it is that name, and I think we definitely had to mention it.
Yeah, remarkable, David. Really is. It just shows that there's a lot behind a building like this and a name like that. And a sign can indeed tell a story.
Oh, very much. And in fact, I think we're going to move on and talk about another sign here momentarily. But before we do that, Dan, and this wasn't something that I had planned on talking about, but I will approach the topic. The picture that we've looked at here a little bit, it has a sign in front of it that is a much more recent sign, and that is the state historical marker that is put up into it. Now, I mentioned that sign, really, it's popped in my mind here. The thought occurs that all of us that have driven around the United States, anywhere, there are a lot of historical markers that look a lot like that. And I know I've seen state historical markers in all the states that I've been to in the United States, which is a lot of them, and they all look kind of like that. How is a sign like that made, and is there a reason why they all kind of look the same?
Well, that's a very good question. There's a few ways they can be made, but what dictates how they're made for the most part is the durability of it. The sign in question here, I'll put it again up so folks can see it. Obviously it says the filling station there. This is a cast bronze plaque, a very large, comparatively speaking, cast bronze plaque. So it's cast like any other metal would be. A mold is made and out of sand, and then a box to form that in, sand and a few other things that are involved in it. And then the molten metal is poured in there and allowed to cool. And then various finishing techniques can be applied to it. And then a final protective coat of paint will go over it, clear coat in this case. So it's a very durable sign. It can be made to last a long, long time. And that's primarily why they're made that way. But they also need to be durable enough to stand up to the elements that it faces day by day.
Sure.
So a sturdy sign like that can withstand wind. In Michigan, it could get snow piled on it. It can withstand that.
Yeah.
So, but the other reason they're designed that way is because in the case of Michigan here, they're green. Most of them are put in areas that have a lot of vegetation or landscaping and whatnot. So it's something that should be aesthetically pleasing and draw people's attention to it, but yet not be so overwhelming that it sticks out in the neighborhood.
That was incredible. Who would have known how much thought and effort and design would go into these, to use kind of a fancy word, ubiquitous signs, because they're everywhere, aren't they?
Absolutely.
And downtown Lansing has many of them. In a future episode, we are going to talk about one of those many, in addition to the one we spent a few moments talking about right now, and that would be one of the many that is in downtown Lansing that speaks to the area's labor history. So stay tuned for that. Hint, hint, Labor Day comes at the end of the summer. So it sounds to me like we've got another episode coming up.
Absolutely.
So you, however, did bring a little bit more than just one sign image for us to talk about today. What else do you have with us?
Well, there's another photo I will grab here. And this is another building located in Old Town. This one is located at 329 Cesar Chavez. And at one point, it was the Bank of Lansing. And this is another example of the signage being tied right into the architecture.
Sure.
Now, in this case, this building is kind of a Greek revival, if you will. It's got some elements of Greek architecture, classical Greek architecture into it. But also what's important is it's a bank. So it is a building that needs to be sturdy and secure and prominent. So the type of signage that would have been appropriate for that, which we're talking turn of the last century, would have been a engraved, a carved stone sign, if you will. So this is a prominent Bank of Lansing sign manufactured right into the stone, which is incorporated right into the building.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting about this sign is as much of what it doesn't have as far as much as what it has. It just says the Bank of Lansing. There's no reference to the word federal mentioned in the name of this bank at all.
Mm-hmm.
So that tells me that the bank was probably formed during a time of relative banking ease in this country.
Mm-hmm.
There was a popular movement during certain banking crises where the name federal would be incorporated into the name of the bank, because once the Federal Reserve System was adopted and, I guess, accepted, I'll use the term accepted,
Sure.
depositors wanted to know that their bank was backed up by the full faith and credit of the United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
In the event of a bank run, they would be ensured that their deposit was still there.
Yep.
And of course, we've seen a little bit of that recently.
Oh, sure.
It's how funny history repeats itself, isn't it, David?
Yeah, we've seen the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is the FDIC, spring into action, and the FDIC is really the end result of some of the events and processes that Daniel's describing when he's talking about bank security, and I'm really glad that is the image that you selected, and as the building and the sign you selected for us to spend a few moments talking about, because it's kind of the same thing that we had going on when we can imagine standing on the street corner, either in front of the old Sinclair oil gas station or in front of the old Bank of Lansing. If we take just a minute and look at our surroundings, oftentimes the sign being the first thing that catches our eye, we can actually learn a lot about a whole big chunk of history just by looking at one sign. And so Daniel referred to a few things going on there with that bank, one of which is being the ups and downs of the financial sector of the American economy. As the United States economy expanded and greatly advanced in its complexity, so did the advancement of financial transactions and the whole banking system. It had to keep up with the way the economy was growing. And so in the early 1900s, actually 1913, the same year that the federal income tax was codified in the Constitution, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Federal Reserve System was created. The FDIC doesn't come along until much later, into the 1930s. So the Federal Reserve was a new banking system for the United States, and it's basically a bank that Congress charters, but it's independent of Congress.
Yes.
It's technically not even part of the government, even though the government regulates it. And then it has to work with the Treasury and the U.S. Mint to control the money supply. Now, that's going to be it, I promise, for our Econ and Banking 101 lesson right now. But, however, I would definitely like to bring up one other building. It's a bank building in Lansing, actually, that also very much has all of the same exterior architectural features that this particular bank that we've been talking about has, including those signs that were actually carved into the stone. But before I get to that, Dan, I want to ask you a question about those carved signs.
Yes.
I have been very lucky in my life to have traveled a bit, and I've seen some buildings that are very, very, very old, hundreds of years old. Actually, in some cases, well over 1,000 years old. And they also have carved into the stone, words on them that tell you what the thing is. It could be a cornerstone, for example. Those came about slightly differently than the type of sign that we're looking at here. But nonetheless, they're information, and they're like the immediate clues to how old a building is. So when the Romans, or let's say medieval stonemasons in erecting a cathedral in Europe in the 10th or 11th or 12th century, carved into stone, what was the difference between the way they did it back then versus the way, say, this bank would have been done much more recently, only 100, 120 years ago?
Well, the Romans would have had the hammer and chisel.
Mm-hmm. Tried and true,
yes,
right?
Yes, tried and true. And they didn't have spell check back then, so
Get it right.
Yep, or start over.
Yep.
Well, when this sign went up, spell check hadn't been invented yet. However, there was one of two ways this sign would have been made. Mm-hmm. The lettering would have been put in at the time the stone was cast, and then the made sign, if you will, would have been lifted up and put into the building at the time of construction. Or it could have also been made with the aid of pneumatic tools, which they would have had at the time that building went up. I mean, it's possible. It also could have been made with a hammer and chisel.
Yeah, see?
But by the time this building went up, we're talking late 1800s likely. There would have been some fairly modern methods by then.
Yeah, late 1800s or early 1900s. I don't know the exact build year on that building, but by looking at it, you could fairly safely say it's probably somewhere between 1890 and 1920 that building was built. And exactly, not having the federal name on
right, that's kind of the giveaway there.
That's a good giveaway, exactly. And there's the other building I wanted to mention, actually, is a building that has many, many stories itself, and it is another bank building in Lansing. It's on the corner of Michigan Avenue and Washington Square, right downtown, where there's a big roundabout now, and just a block from the State Capitol building. That building, it has a lot going on it. It has a beautiful bronze plaque. I think it's bronze. I've learned now after today's episode. I'm quite certain it is, because it looks very much like the sign we just talked about. On the south side of the building, there has the Pledge of Allegiance carved into it, and is the original Pledge of Allegiance, not the one we say now. I won't mention the difference. You can look it up. Then on the, I guess it would be, the east side of the building is the really fancy, amazing part of it. It's the cherry on the cake. It is a carving by Ulysses Ritchie, who's a very well-known artist. It's a bas-relief type of a carving. And Ritchie carved, amongst others, the Bank of Canada building in Ottawa, Canada. He's a very well-known artist from that time period. And the carving, the sign, if you will, is a scene of a day in the life of Lansing where a guy robs the bank and gets caught by the police. So, a lot going on there.
There is, indeed. A lot going on. But I'm glad you mentioned that, because this ties in a little bit to what we talked about the last episode, where signs all incorporate a value of functionality, but a value of artistic value as well. And that's a really good example of it. And especially in those days, all sign makers were artists. And they are nowadays too. It's just a different set of skills, if you will. But it was more of a fine art element back then, I think. Whereas now the art and science are more melded together. But that's a great example there. And again, tying it into the architecture, obviously it tells a story and a riddle, if you will.
Oh, very much.
But also, when people are putting their money in a bank, they want to know it's secure.
Oh, absolutely. And to go back to what you just said, I want to expand our thoughts on that for just a moment. Art and functionality. And nowadays, I think that we say art and functionality, and understood that maybe those things are sometimes the same, but maybe they're not either. Whereas in the pre-industrial world, people hardly ever distinguish between what we may call design and maybe what we would call utility. The two were not separated in the way we separate them now. In fact, people oftentimes thought you couldn't separate them. In order for something to truly function good, it had to instill a type of feeling in you.
Sure. Absolutely.
And even industrial tools, and I know we're deviating a little bit nowadays, but Daniel, this is something you and I have talked about before. Even when you look at some of the great industrial machinery that was made
absolutely,
way back when in the, say, the Art Deco era, the 20s and 30s, and it has a design element to it that actually exceeds, I think, the functionality.
Oh, for sure. But nowadays that stuff's incorporated in it too. It's just in ways we don't think about. There's a movie out there about the font Helvetica.
Oh, yes.
That I encourage everyone to watch. And the font itself, there's a lot more to it than you think about, but it's like a lot of good signage nowadays. The attitude is almost it's there, but it's not, if that makes sense.
It does. It's sort of, you would notice it if it wasn't there, but you don't necessarily notice it when it is there.
And a lot of the messages are almost subconscious. And especially if you look around at modern bank signage, it actually has a very important and prominent message it's sending. It's just almost subconscious. It's more of a familiar and a comfortable message versus brick or stone stability like the earlier bank signage was.
Sure. It's security. And now it's sort of comfort and security.
Yes. But every bit the thought that went into the old signage certainly goes into nowadays too.
Sure.
Just in different ways.
I think that's a good place to leave off then for our episode today. I want to thank you very, very, very much for coming by, Dan.
My
really
pleasure.
Appreciate it. We always enjoy learning about these things in our community, and all of you will, of course, now have at least a couple more buildings, 3 really, in Lansing to go ahead and take a look at next time you're in this lovely area. So we will close out there, and I will see all of you next time.
You've been listening to Lanstories with me, David Siwik. For more information on this program and to stream past episodes, visit lccconnect.org. LCC Connect is the official home of the voices, vibes, and vision of Lansing Community College, offering hours of original and exciting programming. Hosted by faculty, staff, and community members, LCC Connect explores our college's work in the community, important topics in higher education, and our vision for the future. Catch the vibe on 89.7 FM or online at lccconnect.org. Until next time, remember, keep telling good stories.